All right, we're back with another edition of Inside TPM. I'm Joe Ragazzo, and I'm here today with executive editor David Kurtz. David, how you doing?
Good, Joe. Thanks for
Good, good,
having
good.
me.
Of course, of course. All right, so we're gonna get into it. If anybody has any questions um, along the way, feel free to drop them in by hitting the Q&A button, and you can just pop a question in there, and we'll try to save some time at the end if there are questions. And if not, we're just going to get right into it real quick here. So, David, I wanted to start here at what I feel like is the logical beginning. Some people might know the story, but let's start with the story of how you came across TPM and then how you inevitably ended up actually working at TPM. I think a lot of people will find it pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was a very much a different time than it is now. Very much kind of right time, right place. But I had been a journalist before I come up working at a alt news weekly back in the day, and then I went to law school and I was practicing law in Missouri, and I kept sending just my own reflections on stuff in the news to an old friend of mine. We just kind of had this running sort of banter that we did via email. And he just started every time I would send something, he would hit me back with something that Josh Marshall had written. And I didn't know Josh. I didn't know, like, blogs just weren't really on my radar. It's not kind of what I was looking for, or I didn't think. And it happened a few times. I was kind of getting annoyed because Josh would have like said the same thing I had just said, right? And so I started sort of reading him to see what the hell was up. And eventually that sort of morphed into me being a regular tipster offering sort of unsolicited, insights on Louisiana politics, where I had worked in journalism before, Missouri politics, which is where I was living at the time. And we just sort of hit it off and started an email exchange ourselves. And when TPM Muckraker started, I guess would have been in 05, 06, one of the first things Josh did was have our new hires for that. It wasn't our yet, but what would subsequently become our new hires, reach out. And so I just became like a source. I was handy. I could provide access to stuff. I could, provide documents that they might have trouble accessing, that kind of thing. And then eventually, not to drag the story out, but eventually Josh just out of the blue was like, man, I just can never get away. Would you be able to sub for me at some point? And so I started doing that on a semi-regular basis. And then it became kind of a regular weekend gig that I did just using my initials because I didn't want to interfere with my law practice or the practice of the firm. And so that just sort of became a real outlet. And I needed an outlet. Like in 2005, when Katrina had hit Louisiana, I just started to feel very limited in in like how much difference I was able to make in the world through practicing law, and felt like a pull to contribute in some other way. And this sort of satisfied that itch. And then it sort of coincided with TPM starting to grow. And it took a little while to figure it out, but eventually TPM grew enough to bring me on, and I left the practice of law and started doing TPM from Missouri, and was managing editor from there for the first about 3 years. And then we got our first outside investment in TPM in 09, and I moved here to DC to open our DC bureau. And so that's how it kind of came to be. It's a path that I think would be hard to mimic now. I think it would have been a path hard to mimic at any time immediately before, immediate after. It was just kind of this weird sweet spot of new media, digital media developing, and just sort of being a great opportunity for me to do the kinds of things that I like to do, but in a format that just fit, and that's still kind of true.
It almost reminds me, I feel like this is, I mean, I don't know that it's common, but you hear about this sometimes in like sports talk radio, where you have a caller who's calling in and eventually like, do you want to actually, you know, be part of the show? Or maybe you could host weekends, and then
Right.
then
Right.
all of a sudden you're not a caller anymore. You're hosting, that happened in Cleveland. I remember this guy. Anyway, that's a different story. But so was journalism always a passion of yours? You were practicing law. How did that
Yeah,
come to
I
be?
mean, it always felt like a natural thing, like an extension of my interests, like something that I kind of would be doing anyway, but not in the sense that I aspired to be a journalist. I know that might sound weird, but it was more that my curiosity, it was a way to satisfy my curiosity. And it was like a window initially as a kid. It was just a window into the world from a relatively rural area of Louisiana. You know, I just want to see the wider world. And it enabled me to do that. And then as I got older and my curiosity expanded, it still sort of enabled me to dabble in lots of different things, to not be kind of super focused or over focused on any one thing, but to sort of satisfy the itch of understanding the world better. And I think that's one of the reasons that the digital media revolution at the time that TPM started was so interesting, because it felt even more expansive and a bigger window into a wider world, and a way for me to answer the questions that I had myself that I wanted to find answers to. So to this day, Joe, I mean, honestly, when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a journalist or an editor, but it's like I almost still don't self-identify that way. It's not key to my identity, which is strange because it's been, 20, 25 years of my adult professional life, which is almost my entire adult professional life. But it's just not like, I don't feel like I'm part of the tribe of journalists. I don't kind of wear it on my sleeve as who I am. It's really, and this is true of a lot of people that we had in early TPM days. It felt like a lot of folks, we would joke, like we would all be doing this anyway. It's just cool to be able to get paid for it, right? And that, I don't think that was the journalist in us. It was just curious people who wanted to be sort of engaged in an intellectual and real way with the world around us. And so, yeah, I mean, echoes of journalism from a very young age, but not maybe in the sense that, like, I was carrying around a notepad and a pencil from it. It was just more of that broad curiosity about it all.
And let's fast forward then all the way now to today. You're the executive editor. You mentioned you were managing editor. What is your day-to-day like as executive editor?
Yeah, so it's changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. Up until, let me give broad executive editor kind of role, and then I'll talk about the specific thing that changed. But, one of the things about being an editor that was appealing to me, especially with the direction that the journalism as a business has gone over the last 20, 25 years, is that it always felt empowering to me to have some role in the business side of what we were doing. Like, I didn't like the idea of sort of bifurcating business and journalism. I mean, I don't mean that in the old church state way. And one of the great things about digital journalism is you're not beholden to big advertisers who might want to have influence over what you're doing. It's very dispersed, and so you're free to kind of do what you want. But you're not free just to do anything, because you're trying to create a sustainable business model that allows you to do good journalism. And so having a role in both the journalism and the business side has always been appealing. And I've always been at small places where that was more likely to be the case, just because there wasn't enough people to sort of divide the labor up in such clear buckets, right? And that's certainly true with TPM. So I oversee the day-to-day editorial work that we do at TPM, which is, say, I oversee the newsroom with the help of two editors who do a lot of the moment-to-moment work. And a lot of it is about, for us, sort of where do we want to position ourselves on stories, not exactly what story we want to do or how do we want to do that story, but like, where do we plant ourselves in this sort of ongoing coverage of a particular area or particular issue or particular thread of news that will allow us to do high level work that's distinct from what everyone else is doing and contribute in some way to sort of the national debate or the national conversation around that issue. And that is it's a different challenge, a different sort of strategic objective than just cranking out stories. So I think most of my time, or at least most of the time in my head, is spent on that, just trying to figure out where to position us, where we ought to be, such that the story doesn't overrun us within a few hours, that this is something that we can put people on in a sustained way, let them get enough expertise and knowledge on this topic or this subject area that they're not just flailing, and that we're not moving them so quickly from thing to thing that they just feel ungrounded and not able to do assertive, high-level, confident journalism that actually tells you something about the world that you might not have known before. And so I think that's a lot of where my role is. And then, it kind of morphs towards the business side, sort of at the first level, is because I was a lawyer. It's just making sure that what we're doing is not exposing us in any way to legal jeopardy, which at an organization our size is a real concern and something that we have to be really cognizant of. And then the work that you and I do, since you oversee the business side, is just trying to marry the business objectives and the editorial objectives in a way that provides a long-term sustainable business model for the company. And we can talk some about that, but obviously that model has changed dramatically for us over the years. And you've overseen a transition from a digital advertising-based business model to a membership model, which has been transformative for us, probably has allowed us to survive in a way that we wouldn't have been able to at all. But that has required like a rethinking of our journalism and how we approach things, and trying to adapt to what we think our members want and our readers want, so that we're actually providing something of value to them that they feel comfortable supporting. And then I mentioned that my role has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years. I took over doing Morning Memo, I guess a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And so my days start now at the early hour. And so I kind of crank that out before the rest of the day gets going. And so it's put me a little more in touch with the news than I had been before. And it's the first time in, gosh, more than a decade that I had responsibility for a particular output myself personally, which has been kind of rewarding, just to actually just do it, right? Rather than overseeing the doing of it or try to guide the doing of it or hit the bank shot of making sure it got done. I can just do it, without having to think too much. So that's the overview of what it's like.
Is there a relationship between, I'm curious how you think about, on one hand, you mentioned providing sort of the top level guidance to the editorial staff about not particular stories, but the way we're covering things and how we're positioning ourselves. How does that relate to actually the creation of the Morning Memo? Like, are those things in concert? Like, do you see Morning Memo almost as not like marching orders, but kind of like an implicit, like, hey, here's kind of where we're at on things?
Yeah, to some extent, that's ended up being really organic and like a nice way to almost like fine tune my thinking on how we should approach stuff. But it's also, look, I mean, the thing that made TPM at the beginning was that you had this monopolistic journalism industry, right? Most towns by that point had like one major paper. There weren't many two-paper towns left. It was an extremely lucrative business for them. And there was just journalistic conventions that had developed over the years to allow you to sustain that kind of business, kind of no matter what town you were in, no matter who you brought in. Like everybody had a pretty set, narrow, confined sense of what it meant to do journalism. And what that meant for us, thank God, was that there were just a ton of inefficiencies and gaps and sort of blind spots in coverage that allowed us to take advantage and sort of sustain ourselves. And I think to some extent, that's still what we need to do, right? Is we need to figure out where those gaps and inefficiencies in coverage are and try to exploit them, not just to sustain ourselves as a business, but because those blind spots, if they're significant and important blind spots, can really color the kind of news that you get, the kind of public debates and national conversations that we have. And so we're still looking for those opportunities. I guess, if I'm honest, that we often talk about it internally in terms of just not doing dumb shit. And, I think exposing myself to a lot of the dumb shit every morning helps me to steer away from the dumb stuff. And it also helps to crystallize sometimes, what needs to be done, like what gaps there are to exploit, and also what's already been done well, because I don't want to disparage everything that's out there. There's lots of good stuff. There's lots of important journalism that happens. It takes some curating to find it, which is sort of the point of Morning Memo, is we're going to curate that for you and kind of give you what you need to know. But once you know what's out there and what's been done well, in some cases, we might piggyback off of what's done well. In some cases, we might just flag it and just like, hey, they've spoken and that's great. And you need to know that. And there's not much we have to add. And then in other instances, it's like clearly just a huge failure in how things are presented or framed or even thought about, right? That it just sort of betray the reader. And so our role then is to try to fix that, at least for the people who read us. And so, yeah, it's been a nice marriage of that sort of strategic approach, but the tactics of getting Morning Memo out every day help me sort of fine tune that.
You alluded a minute ago about how TPM's business has evolved, and obviously that's, as you know, that's where I spend most of my time thinking about is how TPM has evolved and should evolve, but also just the general news business ecosystem, how it evolves, because obviously we're a part of it, so we have to be reactive to it. Things like going from an advertising-based business to a membership-based business. Other companies have evolved in different ways. They, moved to do more video, or maybe they don't have a homepage, or these things we've seen over time. But how would you, setting aside the business implications of things, how has political journalism changed since you've been at TPM? Obviously there are new publications come and go, and delivery methods evolve, but how do you think about the changes that
Yeah, I mean, there have been substantial changes that have forced us to really reckon with what we do, what we're good at, what we can consistently do well. Back at the beginning, as I outlined a minute ago, there were so many gaps and inefficiencies, and one of the big ones was just that the major national publications were slow. They were starting to put, digital, I mean, not starting, they had been putting things online for a while, but it roughly corresponded to either their print schedule or to their night before print schedule. And so, our bread and butter for the first several years was that we could get a story out, not on every topic, but on the things that we cared about and covered, that was 80-85% as good as what the New York Times was going to do, but we could do it 15 hours earlier. And so there was a lot of value in that. And so that sort of quick metabolism, the ability to get things that were happening in real time, communicate with readers about it in a smart but also fast way, was what I consider sort of the core of TPM. And when I talk about it internally now, I talk about it in terms of we were able to make a lot of noise. And it was like a quiet library, right? And we didn't think it should be a library. We thought library was the wrong paradigm for what news should be. And so we came in and made a lot of noise. And then what happened was that a lot of people started to pick up on that, not just copying us, because I think that's a little too self-absorbed of us to think about it that way. But there was some of that. And then just figuring out their own reasons for and business reasons for doing more digital journalism in a way that was more native to the digital format, right? Which is really what the difference was. If your native format was print, that had its own set of expectations and all the rest. If your native format like ours was digital, then it came with its own set of assumptions and presumptions. And as more people started to do that, it just got louder and louder and louder. So suddenly, instead of us trying to create some noise in order to provide more clarity and more insight and sort of get your attention on what really mattered, it just became a cacophony of noise that I think was hard to differentiate, was hard to figure out what's what. I think the social media revolution is when it really sort of spilled over into like too much for folks. I'll be honest, it took me a while to sort of piece that together. I mean, we kept trying to do the quick and on top of things all the time mode for quite a while, probably after it had reached its peak. And so the approach we take now is there's so much noise out there. We're trying to cut through that and give you some semblance of like what you really need to know, right? Not waste your time, not just try to grab your attention, but to really give you a solid foundational sense of what's important, why we think it's important, and respect your time, respect your bandwidth, your attention span. And I don't mean that, that we're going to give you big, long stories about everything, but we're not going to just sort of spin up, the latest controversy for controversy's sake, which I don't think is anything we ever did. But there were times that it got closer to that than I was probably comfortable with. And now it's much more curating this crazy incoming stream of information in a way that can really, make you feel in touch with the news, informed, maybe even walk away a little smarter, but without having to sit glued to it moment to moment and just get inundated by the deluge. So that's been the biggest change, I think, since we started doing this.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I don't, not our readers necessarily, but I do think that there's this notion in the broader news reading community that the general way it works is kind of like a tail wagging the dog situation where the business people come in and they say, look, this is what's making money now. You've got to change the way you're doing things so that we could make money. And it's way more nuanced for us at least. Like, and the
Yeah.
thing that you just highlighted is what I come back to a lot. And we've talked about this over the years of the way our business model used to be, where we had lots of page views and we could monetize it by advertising, was because we were capitalizing on a market inefficiency, that there was a lot of news that wasn't out there. So we were providing it. And now it's just that the environment has changed.
Yep.
And it's not just that we said, look, page views aren't worth as much anymore. That just happened to be the case. It's really more about matching the business and monetization strategies to what is journalistically important. And I think that's the key, and that's what people miss. So I'm just really glad to hear you explain that. And I think it's really interesting. You
Yeah,
talked
and
about it
Joe,
a
part of it
ton.
too, from the get-go, we were always, even before a social media revolution and then through it, we were always really focused in a way that I don't think print publications were able to be, on not who we imagined our readers to be or who we wanted our readers to be, but who our readers actually were. And I don't mean that in the sense that we had some perfect vision, but we were cognizant that, if you do good journalism that no one reads, it kind of calls into question how good the journalism is. Now, I have to be careful when talking about this because obviously sometimes the most important, most complicated stories aren't going to fly around like a celebrity news story, right? I get that. But for our people, right, who are political junkies, deeply invested in American politics, engaged in their own lives and politics in some way, there was a realization that if we couldn't connect with them, that we weren't doing it right. And so that was a little more challenging when it was a advertising-based business model, because we were kind of having to balance the things that we knew would do really well, but probably couldn't be justified journalistically or were more questionable. And so that was like, you were constantly trying to compensate for that. But then the new business model, the membership business model, is just so much more aligned with those principles, right? Like if you're going to support us, you're probably going to read us. You're not going to support us if you're not reading us. And so I feel like there's a way in which we just have this simpatico with the readership that makes what we do feel more valuable because we kind of know who we're servicing with it. And it kind of keeps you honest, right? Because it's still like, we're still aware of like who's reading what and how much is getting read. And so we can still tailor what we're doing to sort of hit people where they need to be hit. But there's not this just like, I guess, throwing stuff against the wall and hoping it sticks, or just casting seeds into the wind and hoping they sprout. There's like a real, a direct connection there. And then that leads to the thing, which I think we've always been able to have, which I can't personally take credit for it all, but I'm not even sure we can take credit for it because it feels almost a little magical, which is just this sense of community and identity that people have with us. So with the membership-based model, we can just do more to create that sense of community, right? We can do things like this. We can have live events, that are targeted towards members. We can talk with folks with a higher level of familiarity and a presumption that they know a lot about what we're talking about already because they're highly engaged and highly informed, but they also read a lot of what we've written. So we're not having to appeal to some common denominator, lowest or not. Like, we just don't have to appeal to some common denominator. We don't have to lard our stories with a lot of context to catch people up who may not be super informed, because that's just not who's reading us, right? If you're not super informed, you're just not going to be drawn to us in the first place. And so it lets us skip over a lot of those perfunctory things, which I think makes it feel more real and authentic to people who really care about this stuff in the first place. So it all kind of comes together in that way.
I want to bring it back to the Morning Memo for a second. One, because I'm very curious how you put it together. And the reason I want to bring it back to the Morning Memo because I think the Morning Memo is really indicative or it's symbolic, or it represents everything we just talked about. This shift in the way we help our readers process and understand the news. A digest of elements from around the web is something that works very well for us now, and it probably wouldn't have made sense to do it that way 10, 12 years ago. So if you talk about like the morning memo, just how it fits into this philosophy, and also specifically how you make it. Because I'm always curious myself when I'm reading it. Was he putting this together yesterday? Did he start the whole thing this morning, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera?
Right. Yeah, so by and large, I put it together that morning. I will collect things over the course of the day, but I do most of the collection first thing in the morning. I will have things often in mind that I know I'll want to write about at some point, but I find if I work too far ahead, it just loses the sense of immediacy and sort of right now presence that I think people find attractive about it and are drawn to. What I'm really trying to do is collect the things that I think are important and that interest me. I hate writing about stuff that doesn't interest me, not only because it's not fun for me, but I think it shows, right? And I'm also looking for a way to condense or to summarize sort of the significance of what happened that day, without just basically without relying on assignment editors everywhere else to tell me what's important, for me to tell readers what's important, but for me to sort of make an independent judgment, which means excluding a lot of stuff, right? And so usually I have this big basket of stuff. I'll see patterns and sort of related things in that basket. I'll throw out the stuff that might interest me, but just doesn't really fit. And then try to really streamline it to related topics, to things that sort of play off each other in a way that starts to make sense. So the collecting kind of happens all the time. The things that I might want to write about, I kind of have in my head, but I'm waiting for like the right news thing to come along to be able to talk about that. And I think I may be talking too vaguely about all this, so we can circle back on more specific stuff. But I think the other piece is just to try to interject some news judgment into what I am presenting, right? And so part of that sometimes means talking about the inefficiencies in political journalism or the gaps or the failures and just being really upfront and blunt about that. Other times it's why this story keeps getting framed as X, but I really think the frame ought to be over here. And here's why, and here's what facts are in this frame that you miss if the frame is over here. And I think the other piece of it is just to try to make it not friendly exactly, but personal, right? That I know who you are, and I'm not trying to like put on, some show for you, but like give you what you really need, that you will feel like, okay, having read this, I don't necessarily need to check in at, periodic hours over the rest of the day, but like I have a pretty good foundation of what's important. So in any event, that's kind of how I try to structure it. But a lot of that happens between 5:30 and 8:30 a.m. and as I'm trying to fly around, try to catch myself up and then figure out what matters the most.
Do you have like a few stories? Like I almost think of it like when you're creating like a TV series, like Sopranos, for example. David Chase would always say like, I have plot A and plot B and plot C, and I'm kind of building them all. As we're going through like the news events over the course of weeks and months, do you have like certain storylines that you're particularly paying attention to that you want to come back to as often as possible?
Yeah, I have. I think the Trump accountability piece, which is really to say like the Trump prosecutions, so the January 6th case, the Mar-a-Lago case, to a lesser extent, the hush money case, and then some of the high profile civil cases like the big fraud case in New York. Those were, for the first several months, year and a half that I was doing this, were sort of the regular touchstones. It combined what I thought was like the most important story, which is the preservation of rule of law in America, with a very dynamic and ongoing and iterative story where there were lots of opportunities for developments over the course of many months, and enough complexity, which I think is another TPM thing. We want to be able to deal in complex stories, but in a way that are accessible. And this allowed for that, right? Enough legal background. I wasn't a criminal lawyer, but enough legal background and familiarity that I could make sense of these things in a way that was easier to read. So that all came to like a pretty screeching halt in June of this year, as it became clear that the prosecutions were just not going to happen before the election and everything was going to be delayed, that Trump's delay strategy had in fact worked. which wasn't the end of the world, but it definitely, like, I felt the absence of that pretty strongly. And the problem, like, obviously, election would be the plan B, right? The next sort of storyline. But campaign and election coverage, I just find to be really difficult to do on a daily basis without falling into the trap of, basically mimicking the way campaign elections have been covered forever, which I just don't find particularly valuable or insightful, and becomes its own little world, its own little game. And it's in its own little world and its own little game around polls and around fundraising and around who's up and who's down and who's won the day and, who gaffed and who didn't. Like, it's all there because campaigns are so freaking nebulous and they are so hard to get a handle on. And so you have these journalistic tropes that we've developed over the years that sort of substitute for that. And a lot of it is just journalists playing off each other, right? Like, we're going to set the standard of, like, who's got momentum and who doesn't. And we're just going to cover that like we would a football game, right? Oh, suddenly, this team's on the march after having been on its heels deep in its own, side of the field and blah, blah, blah. And it's not real. Like, none of that is real. And the poll coverage, I think, has just become more and more of a crutch. So it has been difficult to capture the dynamics of the election, in part because I think it's just hard to do. It's hard for everybody, and that's why the coverage looks like it does. But the demand for it is so high that people keep doing it, right? They keep feeding the beast on this front. And so since things kind of fell apart on the Trump front, I have struggled, I think, to find kind of the same sort of consistent storylines. But certainly, the rise of Trumpism, or the reemergence for a second term of Trumpism, I think, has been that consistent theme, and the ways in which, especially since Harris became the Democratic nominee, in which he has really zeroed in on race and xenophobia, and to some extent, or in an equal way, attacks on transgender people, like those kind of ways of him creating the enemy, the common enemy for his supporters to loathe and to rally around as a way for him to achieve political power again. And at the same time, continue to knock at the pillars, the foundations of a democratic society. I think that is like the key thing. And I was just talking with someone this morning saying that it's been hard to keep a sense of humor and a sense of the absurd, which is a very TPM thing, right? Is that we try not to take ourselves too seriously, even as we take the work seriously. And it's gotten harder to do that in this era because this stuff is really freaking important. And I don't want to be in a position of looking back, Joe, in 5 or 10 years at what I wrote in late October of 2024 and have it be some frivolous thing or absurd thing or funny thing, knowing what we are on the potential brink of. And so that has been an additional challenge too.
So that's a good segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is just the differences of covering this election versus, any of the other elections. And there are things that are obvious. Biden, one of the candidates dropped out and was replaced by a different candidate. We have someone running for president who already has been president but is not the incumbent. So, and that person is Donald Trump. So there's obvious things, but specifically from like a journalistic perspective, where you're trying to assign stories and like, what are some of the differences in the things that are challenging us?
Yeah, I mean, there've been so many historic, 2 assassination attempts, right? I know it's hard for a lot of people not to blame Donald Trump for having incited so much political violence, that there's an irony in him being the victim of that. But I see that not as a, like, who gets the blame or who gets the responsibility for that, but just that, like, any political violence is so toxic and so insidious that any movement in that direction, no matter the source, no matter the origin, is critically a critical threat to democracy and civil society. So that's just another way in which this is all so weird. But I think look, this is a broader answer to your question because I think it transcends elections, but it's particularly pointed in election years, which is that when we started doing this, one of the goals that we had at the time was for our journalism, for our reporting in particular, to be so reliable and so precise that whether you agreed or not with our center-left editorial point of view, which colored a lot of the framing of the stories that we did, that you were going to rely on our reporting, that you would see value in that reporting. And there were lots of Republican elected officials, Republican staffers on the Hill Republicans around the country who knew our work, who read our work, and it felt like we could still have an influence on the political debate because there remained shame, there remained, an aversion to corruption, there remained an aversion to extreme hypocrisy, there remained an aversion to embarrassing, personal misconduct, right? And so in exposing those things and bringing those things to light and highlighting them and keeping attention on them for much longer than traditional media often did, we were able to score, in journalistic terms, some big victories back in the day. And what's happened is that, we all know this, and there's ways it's manifested that go way beyond journalism, is that the pool of people who actually rely on facts and truth and the reality-based universe has dwindled, or at least no longer includes like a significant chunk, maybe 35 or 45% of the country. And so our journalism just doesn't have, like, we were often focused on the nexus of politics and policy where those decisions were being made. Like, that was our bread and butter. And most of the time now, it feels like we're preaching to the choir, right? And that just changes everything about what you're trying to position yourself to do, what you're trying to focus on, what you think will make a difference in the world. And that's been the biggest change. And I don't think we've fully adapted to it yet. I don't know where it goes from here. But in a world in which Liz Cheney and AOC are on the same side, it is really difficult to figure out where to position yourself to most influence debate when a significant chunk of the country is happy just to dispense with sort of democracy as we know it and proceed towards some unknown and unseeable authoritarian future, right? Not to be too dramatic about it, but that's the big difference.
Yeah. I want to talk about one more journalistic thing that a couple other fun things, so to speak. I want to talk about climate change coverage because you sneak it in. I don't know if you sneak it. It's in the Morning Memo Times, and climate change is one of these things where over the years, we get lots of people who say like, TPM, why don't you cover climate change more? And I think it's something that we've talked about a lot, and we have a good reason why it's difficult for us specifically to make inroads there, and why climate change is difficult to cover in general. And I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about that because I think it's an interesting topic, both about climate change, but also about how journalism works and where an organization like TPM kind of picks its battles and how to approach things.
Yep. Yeah, I gave the answer to it a second ago, which is that for so long we've been focused on the nexus of politics and policy. If a story is purely political with no policy implications, we consider that sort of like cotton candy. That's like a who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing. It's like a horse race story. It's very much politics devoid of policy, and we try to avoid that. Policy devoid of politics, we try to avoid too, which is to say, if there's just nothing happening on that issue, if there's nothing happening in the political realm, if it's not part of the larger national debate in any one time, it's kind of like just chipping away at a stone wall, right? It's just slow going, and at our size and with our resources, there's not a lot of value. Now, I know that's not going to be a satisfying answer for everybody, but the truth is, with a brief exception in 2009, and I'll talk about that in a second, that climate has not been at the center of our national political conversation or debate in a serious way. And even over the last 2 years, when the IRA came through, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not called the Climate Change Act, right? That was kind of we obviously covered that. We covered that in an important way, but even the people that were pushing, the Biden administration and their supporters who were pushing to get that through, weren't framing it around that issue, right? It was other issues. There was that brief period in 2009 where there might or might not have been a carbon tax, and we had to make a hard decision that healthcare we thought was more representative of kind of where the center of gravity was and where the fights were going to be over the course of the Obama administration. That, I think, turned out to be absolutely the right call. And quickly, any kind of carbon tax went away. But it's a frustrating thing, right? I think I've written about this recently. There's kind of how, like, what stories you even include in the frame, and then how you treat those stories that are in the frame. And climate change at a national political level has just not been in the frame very much. And I try to give a nod to it in a way for the same reason that I mentioned before, that I kind of don't want to look back in 10 years and see me writing about bullshit stuff on the advent of what could be the last election as we know it, right? And it's the same way, I don't look back in 10 or 20 years and just have there be no mention of what I think is the overriding story of our time, right? Which is climate change. And so I try to acknowledge it. I think about it a lot. And I don't mean to suggest there's nothing happening out there, right? There's been huge transformations in industry and business around it. There's been huge transformations on understanding of it, but a lot of where the political debate has been on it, as you well know, Joe, it's around things like, climate change denialism, which we covered a lot when I think there still wasn't quite of enough of a scientific consensus was already well established, but like not enough of a public consensus. But now it just feels like a cheap, easy thing to write about because like everyone who reads us knows it's real. There's no value in us repeating that over and over again. I think I try to remind folks that while there's been a lot of progress, it's not enough and it's not fast enough, that we're not on target for the objectives that we set to try to minimize the worst effects. And even those would be still catastrophic in ways that we don't fully understand yet. But if we're not hitting those marks, that the consequences get even more dramatic and drastic and even less able for us to ascertain. And so it's the kind of thing that it's a kind of a chronic source of frustration for me, to be honest. And I think there's people out there who are doing good work in that realm. And I don't mean to minimize their work at all. I think it's vital work. But for what we do, for what we have a skill set for, and for what we're good at, it just has not often been a good fit. And I'll probably get a few emails about this, but I'm happy to engage on it. I mean, I like more than anything, I would like emails that show me where it is like a place for us. Like, don't just tell me I'm wrong about the assessment, but show me where the thing is we should be covering that actually might be in play next year with a Republican Senate and a Republican House, which is probably the most likely outcome. And I'm not making predictions, but just if you were trying to assess, it's hard to imagine, there being a lot of progress on this, even if Harris wins, right? So that's a huge source of frustration for me too. There is no sign down the road. And I'll make one sort of meta comment and then I'll shut up on this point. But I don't think that the rise of authoritarianism in Western democracies and the climate change thing are entirely unrelated. I think there's a way in which the amount of change and the amount of dislocation that is already happening, and I mean that by like the ways in which climate change itself is already manifesting, as well as the ways in which it undermines existing political coalitions, undermines existing the political economy changes that need to happen to address all of this, are all implicated in ways that I think are destabilizing and cause it's not entirely to blame, but are an additional factor in Western democracy struggling with maintaining sort of the robust democratic foundations that they've had up till now. So that's my little speech on that, but I'll stop there.
All right. Usually I ask people if they have a movie recommendation that they've come across. I want to ask you something different, which is about the documentary you saw last night, 64 Days, by Nick Quested, which I still sounds weird to me because he used to direct music videos for like Dr. Dre and Trick Daddy. But talk a little bit about like what'd you think about it? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, so Nick was embedded with the Proud Boys in the weeks leading up to January 6th. And so 64 days is the period of time from election day 2020 until January 6th. And he had extensive access to the Proud Boys. And such extensive access as he was describing last night as he was screening the documentary that he was a suspect, right? They were like, are you really a journalist or are you one of these guys? He talked about having his visa under review, about like there being some consequences to him because there was so much suspicion. And I don't know this story. He would have to tell it, but he related some of that last night. But it was just a good reminder of how open and obvious and blatant the planning and the prep was for this, which I think we knew at the time. We were paying attention. We went into January 6th highly concerned about what that day was going to be. We were prepped for it being a big deal kind of day and things could get really crazy really quick. But even with all of that, it was still a little sobering for me how much I have forgotten over 4 years. I mean, the thrust of it, of course, I remember, and the lessons to be learned from it, of course, I remember. But some of the details had started to get foggy, and so it was just interesting to see some of that up close. And then there was a Q&A after. It was moderated by former TPM Ryan Riley, and it had a couple of the staff investigative counsel for the House January 6th committee were present, and a Capitol police officer who was pretty badly beaten up and had serious injuries coming out of January 6th. And so just listening to them all talk about it and just reflecting on it all, it was just, and I wrote about this morning in Morning Memo, it was just a reminder that the forces that gave rise to January 6th were unleashed well before then and existed independently of the election, were harnessed for Trump's purposes in trying to win that election or overturn the results of that election. But they haven't gone away. And Trump hasn't relinquished that role or let go of that harness. And so in many ways, we are still experiencing the same dynamics in a less acute moment to moment. The vice president is not about to be hanged, and members of Congress are not about to be massacred as it was on January 6th, but that the fundamental ingredients are still there, and the pressures from Trump and others in that direction are still there and are poised to try to do the same thing this time around. There are changes that have happened. I think that will make that harder. Most notably, he's not in power now, which I think just means he's got fewer tools at his disposal. But it was a good reminder that this is an ongoing threat and that January 6th wasn't really a culminating event. It might have been a peak in a story that has many peaks and valleys and is continuing. And that's pretty freaking sobering.
Okay, now, as they say, time for something totally different. You're something of an outdoorsman. Okay, whenever you go on vacation, it's to like Patagonia, or I think where'd you go to? Where did you go with all
I was
the
in Central
volcanoes?
America. I did a volcanic climb down
You
there.
have stories about going, falling down mountains with your brothers. So
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about,
It's true.
you could take this wherever you want to go with it, but like some of your favorite memories or trips or places you'd recommend, wherever you want to go with it,
So
talk
I
about it.
think I grew up in South Louisiana, which is flat as a pancake. Mountains always had a draw, and I didn't see them until I was probably, I think I was 20. I moved out to Oregon and started doing climbing in the Cascades. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And I'm kind of surprised that I didn't, run into more trouble than I did. And I ran into a little. But yeah, getting out and away, especially with the way that we kind of have our noses pressed to the computer screen, but also to kind of the window on American politics, just having a vantage point that lets me see miles instead of inches is huge for my mental health. And it makes my vacations feel like more of a vacation than if I just try to go chill somewhere. So they tend to be kind of active. I did like a 2-week Patagonia trip last year that there was like a 40-mile, 4-day trek that was involved. I've got a trip planned next summer with my 3 brothers. We're going to, raft the Grand Canyon for a week.
Awesome.
So that will be fun. We've got, there are some family stories of me dragging these guys on stuff that I shouldn't have been dragging myself on, let alone anybody else, and them always coming out worse for wear. So these are stories my kids have come to just think are the best stories ever. And so there's like a second generation now of these stories being told. But yeah, I love being outdoors. It's one of the things I miss. Now I've been in DC 15 years now, is just easy access to the outdoors. I used to fish, gosh, at least once a week, and oftentimes many, many more times than that. And that's just not an easy thing for me to do here. It's a little more time consuming also than I have time for, but yeah, I love getting out there. I'm trying to get smarter about it as I get older because the margin of error is not as wide. But yeah, I don't think of myself as either an outdoorsman or an adventurer. Like that's a different level, and I'd hate to portray myself as something I'm not, because my skill level is not that high, but my enthusiasm is high, and that's often been my Achilles heel, is more enthusiastic than I am smart. But yeah, it's great fun, and I look forward to those kind of trips.
Okay, last question. We'll close on this. I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you're a big baseball guy. World Series begins tonight. Who do you got? Dodgers, Yankees? It doesn't matter if you don't care what your gut telling
No,
you.
in a way, I don't care. It's funny. So the Dodger Yankees series in the late 70s and early 80s were my first exposure to baseball. And so it kind of blew my mind to realize that it had been 43 years, I think, since the Dodgers and Yankees had met up. The Yankees had a Louisiana guy who, lived real near where I grew up, Ron Guidry, Louisiana Lightning on those Yankees teams back then. So I just have a real nostalgic attachment to these two teams, even though I know everyone loves to hate them both. And I kind of do too during the regular season. But since my team, the Nats, can't be in it, I'm happy to watch these two battle it out. And especially with Judge and Ohtani going against each other. I mean, it's just, I'm looking forward to it, but without like a rooting interest. And I don't like predicting sports because then I get wedded to my prediction and I can't just enjoy the surprise of what's going to happen. So I am happy just to let it unfold. The more games it goes, the better, because I just would love to see these two teams hash it out.
Awesome. We'll leave it there. David, thank you so much. This has been great. Really, really appreciate it. So thanks for taking some time out to chat with me today.
Absolutely. Take it easy.
All right. Thanks.